My husband changed the locks on Christmas Eve while I was buying groceries for our dinner. He pushed my suitcase onto the porch, introduced me to the woman wearing my robe, and said 4 words that would cost him everything: "The house is mine now." He forgot one small detail. My name was still on the deed. Snow was falling on Christmas Eve when I stood on the porch with grocery bags in both hands and wrapped presents tucked under my arm. I was 47 years old, tired in that familiar way that comes from years of quietly carrying too much. But I was happy that night, or thought I was. The outdoor lights were off. Martin always turned them on by 4. The windows were dark. I reached into my coat pocket, found my key, and slid it into the lock. Nothing happened. I tried again. The key spun loosely without catching anything. My stomach dropped before my brain could catch up. The lock had been changed. I stood in the cold, staring at the door, trying to make this fact into something that made sense. Then the door cracked open, just enough for Martin to stand in the gap with his arms folded. He was wearing the gray sweater I had bought him 2 birthdays ago. He looked at me without surprise, without warmth, without anything resembling the face of someone I had shared a life with. "You're not coming back inside," he said. I laughed, because it had to be a mistake. It was Christmas Eve. I was holding groceries. He didn't respond. He simply looked at me and waited, as if he had rehearsed exactly what came next. Martin disappeared into the hallway and came back pulling my large blue suitcase. He pushed it across the threshold and it landed on its side near my feet. He looked at me once more, his face completely still, and closed the door. I stood listening to the snow fall. Then the door opened again slightly, and a woman appeared in the hallway behind him. She was younger than me, mid-30s, wearing a pale green robe. My robe. The one I had left hanging on the bathroom door that very morning. Martin stepped back into view beside her. He introduced her without a pause, like he was stating something obvious and long settled. "This is Stephanie. She's staying here now." I asked what he was talking about. He answered a question I hadn't asked. He said we had been texting about separating, that I had agreed to give him space in the house, that I had stopped responding to him. Stephanie had slipped back inside. Martin waited in the doorway while I opened my message thread with shaking hands. The last exchange was 3 days ago, me asking if he needed anything from the store, him sending a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing about separation. Nothing about any arrangement. I held the screen up. He barely looked. He said his phone showed something different. The neighbors across the street had their Christmas lights on. I stood in the dark while Martin said the 4 words that made everything clear. "The house is mine now." He closed the door. I stood on the porch in the snow with groceries in both hands and a suitcase at my feet, and I let my brain do what it does when shock begins to clear. It started searching. Not for an emotion. For something specific and solid. 4 years ago, Martin and I had sat across from a real estate lawyer at a long table covered in paperwork. Martin had been impatient, skimming pages and signing wherever he was pointed. I had read every single word. Near the end of the closing documents, I had asked the lawyer to make one adjustment to the ownership structure. He made it right there at the table. Martin hadn't noticed because he wasn't paying attention. I walked to the end of the driveway and sat down on the low stone wall near the mailbox. I called my sister. Paulette answered on the second ring and I told her everything. She said she was already getting in the car. While I waited, I opened my email on my phone and searched the archive for the property closing documents. I had forwarded them to myself years ago out of habit, a habit Martin used to tease me about. The deed was right there in my inbox. I opened it and found exactly what I remembered asking for. Both names. Equal ownership. I sat on that cold stone wall and let the feeling of it settle through me. Then Paulette's headlights appeared at the end of the street. Paulette pushed the passenger door open before she had fully stopped. She handed me a travel mug of tea she had clearly made before I even called, which told me she had been waiting for something like this for longer than either of us had said out loud. I loaded my suitcase and got in. The heat hit me all at once, and I realized how cold I had gotten. She drove and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I did. When I got to the part about Stephanie in my robe, Paulette's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She didn't interrupt. She waited until I finished, then asked the right question. Do you still have access to the house documents? I was already looking. The closing email from 4 years ago was sitting in my archive. I opened the attachments one by one. Title insurance, closing disclosure, and then the deed itself. I found the section the lawyer had changed at my request on the day we signed. Both names were printed clearly, Martin Elwood and Carol Elwood, joint tenants with full and equal rights of ownership. Not secondary. Not conditional. Equal. Paulette pulled into her driveway. I tilted the screen toward her. She read it twice. If your name is on the deed, she said slowly, how can he legally lock you out? I had been turning that question over since I sat down on the stone wall, but hearing Paulette say it out loud made something click into place. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. The changed lock, the suitcase on the porch, the woman in my robe, none of it was simply cruelty. It was illegal. Martin had physically removed a legal co-owner from a property she had every right to occupy. Paulette made up the guest room while I sat at her kitchen table. I wasn't crying. I was working. 2 years earlier, my colleague had used a real estate lawyer during her divorce and spoken highly of her. I had saved the number in my contacts without quite knowing why. I found it now. I left a detailed voicemail. The office was closed for Christmas, but the greeting said she returned urgent calls within 2 hours. She called back in 45 minutes. Her name was Rosalind. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one clarifying question about the timeline. Then she went quiet for a few seconds. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular calm of someone who has seen exactly this situation before and knows every step of what comes next. She asked one more question, and the way she asked it told me she already understood the whole situation. She wasn't searching for information. She was building a case. Did he physically change the locks? Rosalind asked. I told her yes, the newer brass hardware, the key that spun freely without catching. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Then she said something I would replay many times in the weeks ahead. He just made a very expensive mistake. She told me to gather every document I had access to. Not to return to the house alone. Not to contact Martin or respond to anything from him until she had checked the property records. I asked why the records mattered if the deed was already clear. She said people in Martin's position sometimes move quickly in the days after a lockout. They try to take steps before the other person can react. She didn't name those steps. She didn't need to. A man who says, the house is mine now, with that kind of practiced calm had been planning this for a long time. Those 4 words weren't impulse. They were a conclusion. Rosalind said she would have something for me by the following morning. After we hung up, I sat at Paulette's kitchen table and listened to the house settle in the cold. Outside, the snow was still falling, the same snow that had been falling when I stood on that porch 2 hours ago, a different person than I was now. Rosalind called the next morning while I was on my second cup of coffee. She had pulled the public property records. The deed was exactly as I remembered. Both names, joint tenancy, no amendments filed at any point. My ownership was fully intact and on the record. But there was something else. 2 months earlier, Martin had applied to refinance the house on his own. He had submitted paperwork listing himself as the sole owner. The lender reviewed the title, found my name, and rejected the application. Any refinance required both signatures. His alone was not enough. Martin had tried to access the home's equity without me months before he ever changed the locks. He had tried the quiet financial route first, and when that failed, he moved to the direct route. The Christmas Eve lockout was not impulsive. It was a backup plan, executed after the first plan had already collapsed. I sat with that for a moment. The December calendar on Paulette's refrigerator showed a tropical beach. It felt absurd. Rosalind said there was one more thing she needed to tell me before the day ended. She paused briefly, then said it plainly. He listed the house for sale. The listing went live this morning. I reached for my phone with my other hand and started searching before she had even finished the sentence. The listing was right there on a major real estate site. Professional photos, a tidy description, and a price set slightly below current market value. I recognized the entryway in one photo. In another, the corner of my reading chair was just visible at the frame's edge. Those photos had been taken sometime in the last week, while I was still living there. Rosalind explained the below-market price. Someone trying to sell fast sets the price low to attract immediate offers. Martin wasn't trying to maximize profit. He was trying to get money quickly, before I could interfere. The sequence was now completely clear. The refinance rejection 2 months ago, the lockout on Christmas Eve, the listing active by Christmas morning. When the refinance failed, selling became the only plan. But to sell legally, he needed me gone, or appearing to have left voluntarily. He had built the story carefully. The texts I never received. The separation I never agreed to. He needed me to believe I had no claim, so I would disappear before I had time to check anything. What he hadn't solved was the law. Rosalind said it simply. He cannot sell without your signature. Any sale requires both co-owners to sign. Without your consent, no transaction can close. The house was going nowhere, and Martin was running out of time to find another way around me. Rosalind told me not to go to the house yet. But 2 days after Christmas, she found out through the listing agency that a realtor had an appointment to take final interior photos before the listing went fully active. The appointment was mid-morning. I got up early and drove alone. I wanted to handle this moment by myself. I parked down the block and walked to the stone wall near the mailbox, the same place I had sat with my grocery bags on Christmas Eve. The snow had frozen into a thin crust over the front yard. The outdoor lights were on now. Stephanie had learned the timer. The realtor arrived in a white sedan. She was around my age, wearing a bright red coat and carrying a camera bag. She walked up the driveway with a professional smile. I introduced myself as the co-owner of the property and told her clearly I had not been consulted about the sale. I said it in a completely ordinary tone. Her smile faded. She looked at the house. The front door opened and Martin appeared on the top porch step. He went completely still when he saw me standing at the end of the driveway. His expression cracked open just slightly. He had been counting on having more time. Time to get the photos, get the offers, get the money moving, before I showed up. Instead, I was already here. Martin came down the steps quickly and spoke to the realtor first. He explained there was a family situation, a minor technicality, something being worked out. The realtor asked directly whether both owners had agreed to list. He said yes. I said no. She looked between us once. I took the printed deed from my coat pocket and handed it to her without a word. She read it in about 15 seconds. Her face settled into that perfectly neutral, unreadable expression that professionals spend years developing. She handed the deed back, picked up her camera bag, and told Martin quietly that she could not proceed with the listing at this time. Then she walked to her car and drove away. Martin stood on the front lawn watching until the sedan disappeared. His hands were at his sides, fingers curled. He turned and faced me. What I saw in his expression then was different from Christmas Eve. That night he had been cold and controlled, certain his plan was already in motion, certain I had nothing. Now something beneath the surface had broken through. He had expected to be much further along. He had expected me to be gone by now, too shaken to act, too ashamed to come back. Instead I was standing in his driveway in a frozen January morning, holding a document that made every single one of his plans impossible. Martin crossed the yard and lowered his voice. He said I had embarrassed him. He said I had interfered in something that was no longer my concern. He said I would regret making him look unprofessional in front of someone like that. Then he shifted tone entirely. He said the deed was just paperwork. That in every real sense the house belonged to him because he had contributed more over the years. More mortgage payments, more upkeep, more of everything. He said the legal document didn't reflect what was actually true. He said it as if the law was simply unaware of his side of things. I didn't argue. There was no point arguing with someone telling himself a story he desperately needed. I said my lawyer would be in touch and turned toward the street. My phone buzzed before I reached Paulette's car, parked down the block. It was Rosalind. I hadn't called her yet. She had already heard from the realtor's agency. The realtor had contacted her own legal team immediately after leaving. Rosalind was filing a formal legal notice that afternoon. It would document that I had been illegally excluded from a jointly owned property and establish an official record. Martin had 48 hours to respond. If he didn't, we would escalate. She said it calmly, the way someone states a fact that is already beyond negotiation. The legal notice was hand-delivered 2 days into the new year. It stated clearly that Martin had changed the locks on a jointly owned property without the co-owner's consent, unlawful exclusion, and that he was required to restore my access immediately or face further legal action. He didn't respond to Rosalind's office. But a neighbor I'd known for 6 years texted me the day after delivery. Stephanie had been there when Martin read the notice. She asked him to explain it. He tried his usual approach, vague reassurances, dismissive language, calling it meaningless technical paperwork. But then she asked him directly about the deed. He told her I had no ownership stake, that the house was fully his, that my name had never appeared on any of the paperwork. She went quiet. Then she asked him once more, very carefully, whether he was certain. He said yes. Stephanie then did what anyone does when a doubt that size lands in their chest. She looked it up herself. Public property records are available to anyone. It takes about 3 minutes to find exactly what's listed on a deed. She found my name. Right there at the top, equal to his, printed in black ink that didn't care at all about the story Martin had been telling her. Stephanie called me. I hadn't expected that. When I answered, her voice was measured and careful, like someone holding something fragile. She said she needed to ask me something. I said okay. She asked whether I had agreed to move out, whether there had been any formal separation before Christmas Eve. I told her the truth. There had been nothing. No conversation, no arrangement, no legal process. I had gone grocery shopping and come home to a changed lock and a stranger in my robe. That was the entire story. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she was sorry. I didn't ask what the apology covered, her part in it, what had been done to me, or the realization of what she had been used for. Perhaps all of it. I told her she owed me nothing. Whatever she had been told, this wasn't her fault. An hour later, I drove to the house. Not to go inside, but because Rosalind had suggested having a quiet witness present when Stephanie left might be useful to the record. I parked at the curb. 20 minutes later, Stephanie came out the front door with 2 bags. She didn't look back at the house. She paused near my car for a brief moment, then kept walking without turning around. I watched until she was gone. Martin's first text came 2 days later. He called the lockout a misunderstanding. He said he had been under enormous stress and reacted badly. He said none of what happened on Christmas Eve had been seriously meant. He used the word overreaction to describe what he had done, which said more about his self-awareness than any amount of explaining could. The second text arrived less than an hour later. He said we could work things out. That he cared about me. That if I came home, everything could be figured out together. He didn't mention Stephanie. He didn't explain the refinance attempt. He said nothing about the sale listing. I showed both texts to Rosalind. She read them without expression and set my phone on her desk. She said they were useful. They confirmed Martin understood the seriousness of what he had done and was trying to prevent legal consequences through personal appeal. A man thinking clearly about his position would have communicated through his own lawyer. Then she explained the next step. We were filing for partition, a formal court request to force the sale of jointly owned property when co-owners cannot voluntarily agree. Once filed, one party can no longer simply stall indefinitely. The timeline moves to the court's control, not the person trying to delay things. It was, Rosalind said, a very powerful tool. Martin would not be able to sit on the house and wait for this to go away. The partition filing moved quickly. Rosalind had everything prepared and submitted within the week. The court sent Martin a formal notice. He had finally hired his own lawyer, and his response came through legal channels now, the tone considerably more careful than his late-night personal texts. The filing meant that if Martin and I couldn't reach a voluntary agreement, a judge could order the house sold and the proceeds divided equally according to the deed. There was no mechanism by which he could hold the property against my will. The unauthorized refinance, the unlawful lockout, the premature sale listing. None of it gave him a stronger claim. The deed was the deed. His lawyer requested a meeting. Rosalind agreed we would attend but told me to make no commitments. I asked what Martin was likely to offer. She said people in his position typically offered something that looked reasonable but contained a hidden cost. A buyout below actual value, or language that quietly waived certain rights. Then Martin texted me directly again. He said he needed to see me face to face. He said there were things I didn't know about. He said it as though those things might change everything. Rosalind said to agree to meet in a public place and to tell her everything immediately afterward. I agreed to the meeting. We met at a cafe a mile from the house. I arrived first and sat facing the door. Martin came through looking tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not overworked or irritable, but something deeper and hollower. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu. He started with something that resembled an apology. He said he had handled everything badly. He said the holidays had been a terrible time. He said he was sorry for how it all came out. I noticed he was apologizing for the timing, not for the act itself. While he was speaking, I observed something beneath the remorseful surface, a compressed urgency, the look of a man who needed something resolved quickly. I opened the folder I had brought and placed a single page on the table. It came from the financial investigation Rosalind had run as part of the partition process. Bank statements. Account activity going back 14 months. Martin looked at the page on the table. The color in his face shifted slowly, a quiet draining. He said nothing. I said nothing. I let him look at the numbers while a city bus moved past the window in the gray January street. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then I folded my hands on the table and waited, because I already knew what the page meant, and now he knew that I knew. The debt wasn't from a bad investment or a mortgage shortfall. It was gambling debt. Online platforms, the kind that are easy to access and easier to lose money on. Martin had been gambling for over a year. The amounts started small. Each loss was chased with a larger bet. Each larger bet deepened the hole further. By Christmas Eve, he owed a significant sum to two separate creditors. The refinance had been his first plan. Access the equity, clear the debt, disappear the problem. When that failed because my name was on the deed, selling the house became the only option left. When he realized he couldn't sell without me, he tried to make me disappear instead, constructing the story that I had voluntarily left, that the house was his, that nothing stood in his way. He hadn't replaced me because he had fallen in love. That realization settled over me quietly. Stephanie had been part of a constructed narrative, her presence supporting the appearance that Martin was settled, in control, the sole occupant of a property that was entirely his. Martin didn't try to deny any of it. He just looked at me and asked very quietly what I was going to do. I told him the court date was set. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he gave one small nod, the kind that means someone has known something for a long time and is finally allowing himself to stop pretending. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. Fluorescent lights, a low ceiling, a judge behind a modest desk. Martin sat on one side with his lawyer. I sat on the other with Rosalind. The gallery was empty. Rosalind presented our case methodically. The deed showing joint ownership. Documentation of the lock change. The refinance application made without my signature. The sale listing active on Christmas morning without my knowledge. The legal notice that had gone unanswered. She laid it out in about 20 minutes. I watched the judge's face throughout. He was very good at listening without showing anything. Martin's lawyer argued that verbal agreements had existed between us. That the lock change was a misunderstanding. That the listing had been premature but not legally significant. The judge let him finish. Then he asked one question, whether there was documentation of any formal separation agreement between us prior to Christmas Eve. Martin's lawyer said no. The judge looked at the papers on his desk for about 30 seconds. Then he looked up. He asked his final question quietly. When Martin's lawyer began to respond, the judge raised one hand. The lawyer stopped. The judge said the case was not complicated. A co-owner had been excluded from jointly held property without legal grounds, without a court order, without any prior agreement. The pattern of refinancing and listing the property without her knowledge demonstrated clear intent. The judge ordered Martin to pay a portion of my legal fees, not all, but a meaningful amount. He ordered the house listed for sale through a court-appointed process, with proceeds divided equally per the deed. He formally entered into the record that the lock change had constituted unlawful exclusion. Martin's lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly. Martin sat very still. He had been still throughout most of the hearing, which I had found more unsettling than open anger would have been. But when the judge finished, that stillness broke. He blinked several times. He looked at the table in front of him. He looked like a man who had built a careful step-by-step plan over many months and had just understood that the math had never worked in his favor. Not once, not from the beginning. We walked out into a gray February afternoon. Rosalind shook my hand and said I had handled everything well. I stood on the courthouse steps breathing cold air. I thought about the stone wall outside the house on Christmas Eve. The grocery bags. The key that wouldn't turn. The dark windows. I had stood on that porch feeling the ground shift beneath me, not knowing yet that the thing Martin had tried to take from me was already, firmly, legally mine. The feeling I had now, standing on those courthouse steps, was not triumph. It was something quieter. It felt like ground that would hold. The house sold 3 months later. The court-appointed agent valued it properly, not the rushed, below-market figure Martin had used, but the actual current market value. Property in our area had risen steadily. The house sold for considerably more than either of us had originally paid, and far more than Martin had tried to list it for before I appeared in the driveway with the deed. My half of the proceeds, after fees and the mortgage payoff, was more than I had expected. More than I had hoped for, even in the most optimistic version of the calculation I had run at Paulette's kitchen table in December. It was enough to buy something outright. Something smaller, entirely mine, with no joint deed and no second name on any paperwork. Martin's half was a different story. After his gambling debts were settled, Rosalind had ensured the creditors were properly accounted for in the process. He walked away with very little. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it with a clear understanding of what had separated our outcomes. I had protected myself quietly, by reading a document carefully 4 years ago. He had tried to take everything from me in the belief that I hadn't. The day the sale closed, Rosalind texted 2 words, "It's done." I was in a grocery store aisle. I put my phone in my pocket and finished shopping. The house I found in early spring was smaller than the one Martin and I had shared. 2 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard that caught good afternoon light through the trees. It needed some work, which I liked. There's something grounding about a house that asks something of you. It makes the space feel earned. I painted the front door myself. A deep blue-green I had been thinking about for years without a reason to use. Paulette came the first weekend and we hung curtains and debated cheerfully about the sofa. The neighbor on the left had a dog that barked at everything. The neighbor on the right left recycling bins out 2 days too long every week. I found both things deeply comforting in a way I couldn't fully explain. I called Rosalind to thank her once the move was complete. She said I had been one of her more prepared clients. I thought about mentioning the forwarded emails, the habit of reading every closing document line by line. But she already knew. That kind of preparation shows itself during a legal process without needing to be announced. 3 weeks after I moved in, a letter arrived on a Thursday with Martin's handwriting on the envelope. I set it on the kitchen table and made tea before I opened it. It was 4 pages long. I sat in the quiet of my own house and read every single word. Martin wrote that he had made the worst mistake of his life. He said he had been in a desperate state for over a year, telling himself that clearing the debt, selling the house, and starting fresh would fix something that had never been about money or property. He said he knew that didn't excuse anything. He used the word inexcusable 3 times. He wrote about the gambling in more detail than I expected. He said he had started attending meetings. That he hadn't placed a bet in 9 weeks. That Stephanie had left shortly after Christmas and that he understood why. He was living in a rented room, the first time in years he had been truly alone with himself, and found it difficult, but thought it was probably necessary. The final paragraph said he hoped someday I might be willing to have a simple conversation. Not to repair anything. He was careful to write that he wasn't asking for that. Just to say the things he had never known how to say while we were living side by side in the same house, sharing the same life, and somehow never actually reaching each other. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I sat with my tea and thought about everything he had written. The porch on Christmas Eve. The suitcase on the steps. Stephanie in my robe. The locked door and the dark windows and the cold working through my coat while I stood there trying to understand what was happening. I didn't write back. Not because I was still angry. Sitting at that kitchen table, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. Anger requires an ongoing effort, a need to keep turning something over and feeling the heat of it. What I felt was something much quieter. It was more like the absence of something that had been taking up too much space for far too long. I had spent much of my marriage being careful in the wrong ways. Careful not to say the thing that might cause friction. Careful to keep the temperature between us manageable. Careful to maintain the appearance of a life that was working, when underneath it hadn't been working for years. The only care that had actually mattered was the 30 minutes I had spent at a closing table 4 years ago, reading paperwork that my husband was too impatient to bother with. Martin had believed, right up until the realtor drove away from our driveway, that he had planned for everything. He had changed the lock. He had arranged a replacement. He had built the story and listed the house. He thought he had removed me from the picture entirely. What he had not done was pay attention. Not to the woman he had been married to, and not to the documents they had signed together. Both failures cost him everything. I set the letter in the kitchen drawer, made myself another cup of tea, and went back to living my life in the house that was mine. The following Christmas, I hosted dinner for the first time. Paulette brought her partner and her 2 grown children, who I had known since they were small. An old friend from work came with her husband. My upstairs neighbor came down with a bottle of wine and stayed 4 hours. I made too much food and felt completely at peace about it. I decorated simply. A small tree in the corner, white lights along the porch railing, candles on the table. The blue-green front door glowed under the porch light when guests arrived. After dinner, when everyone was settled with dessert and the conversation had found its natural, unhurried pace, I stood at the window and watched snow falling into the backyard. I thought about the other Christmas Eve. The grocery bags. The key that wouldn't turn. The dark windows. The suitcase landing on the frozen porch with that hollow sound. The cold working through my coat while I stood there trying to understand what was happening. Martin had thought he was ending my story. He believed a changed lock and a carefully constructed lie were enough to erase what I had built. What he could not have understood, because he had never paid close enough attention, was that I had been protecting this story long before I ever needed to. He gave me a locked door. I already had the deed. I turned away from the window and went back to join the people who had stayed. There is something I have thought about many times since that Christmas Eve on the porch. It isn't the lockout, or the court, or the money. It's something much smaller. It's a 30-minute conversation at a real estate closing table 4 years ago, when I was tired and impatient and could have done what Martin did. Skimmed the pages, signed where I was pointed, and trusted that the details didn't matter. I didn't do that. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was years of watching women around me trust that things would work out and then find out too late that they wouldn't. Maybe it was simply that I am someone who reads documents. That's all it was in the end. That small, ordinary habit was the thing that saved me. What I know now, sitting in my own house in the quiet that belongs entirely to me, is that we often protect ourselves in ways we won't understand until much later. We forward an email we might never need. We ask a lawyer to make one small change. We keep a folder of papers in a drawer just in case. These things feel like nothing at the time. They feel like caution without cause. Until one night in the snow, when a door is locked against you and the only thing standing between you and losing everything is a piece of paper with your name on it, and you already have it in your inbox. Read the fine print. It matters more than you know.